Hello everyone, welcome to the Beanstalk Family Visitor Center inside the D&H Canal Museum. My name is Dave Kime. This is our Friday night lecture series. Tonight we have John Wadlin, who will be discussing the life of Judge Alton Brooks Parker. Now John was a former chair of the SUNY Ulster Board and was also president of the Ulster County Bar. Everyone, please welcome John.
Thank you. I want to talk about a period of history sometimes called the progressive era, but really the Gilded Age, and the life of Alton Brooks Parker. And this is kind of an appropriate place, the canal, because it was kind of ending as the Gilded Age ended in the late 1890s. And Alton Parker is known in some books as the last of the Gilded Age statesmen. He was written up in a few books that got me interested in this topic. One in the 1930s is They Also Ran. It was a book about everybody who ran for president of the United States and lost. And then there's a judge in the South, a federal judge, Leslie Southwick. He's followed that with a book about all of the president's candidates and vice presidential candidates who also lost. And the reason we bring that up, of course, Parker did lose, as you'll learn, but Parker is probably one of the most obscure of all of these very obscure people. So after tonight, hopefully he will not be so obscure in Ulster County. We have a few more guests, so we'll see if we can get them seated. As you can see here, Alton Parker was born 1852. He was born in Cortland, New York. And there's actually a elementary school named after him in Cortland. He was a good student, and one day he went to court with his father. I'm not sure why, but he saw the attorneys and the judges there, and he said to himself, someday I'm going to be a lawyer, maybe even a judge. By age 16, he was a teacher already, because most people, got through 6th grade, that would have been about it. But he was a teacher in a school in Virgil, New York, near Binghamton. And then he saw an opportunity to be a principal in Accord, New York, in a 2-room schoolhouse. He was probably one of the 2 teachers. And he came to Accord, and very fortuitous, he was put up, given room and board, with the Schoolmaker family. And as you'll see, a few years later, he married the Schoolmaker's daughter. Many of you have probably seen this and not paid too much attention to it, but it's on Route 209, and it's in good shape. A lot of these are not, but this one tells us about the period of time that he lived, and that he taught school there, and then was chief judge of the Court of Appeals, which is our highest court in the state of New York. As I said, he was engaged to Mary Louise Schoolmaker. They got married in October of 1873. He had gone to Kingston to read law. That's how most lawyers became lawyers. They read law in an existing law office. But he also went to Albany Law School for 1 year. Any idea when Albany Law School started, Bill?
It's the second oldest law school in the country.
Second oldest. Okay, so it would have predated 1873 by quite a bit? Okay, that's good to know. We've got another expert here with us. He was clerk of the Board of Supervisors here in Ulster County, 73 to 76. He campaigned for his friend Judge Schoolmaker, getting him elected. And then Judge Parker was elected surrogate judge at the age of 25 here in Ulster County. And that filled out a term. He had to run the next year. And although he was a Democrat in a Republican county, the Republicans did not put up any opposition to him. He was elected surrogate, which was a part-time position. It actually remained a part-time position until the 1960s when our local surrogate became full-time. He enjoyed that work, but you could also be a politician in those days and be a part-time judge. And he was quite active in the Democratic Party throughout New York. He went on to attend the first Democratic National Convention in 1880. And then he worked for Grover Cleveland, who got the nomination in 1884 and became the president. Cleveland being the only Democrat elected president of the United States from Lincoln, 1860, until Woodrow Wilson, 1912, the only one. And as many of you know, Cleveland was elected, he was defeated, he was elected again. But when he took office, Grover Cleveland, in 1885, he knew that Parker had done a great deal of work for him, so he wanted to reward Parker. And Parker went down to Washington, and they offered him a very prestigious position, that of Assistant Postmaster General. But Parker declined. He said, I like what I'm doing back in Ulster County, and he came back to Ulster County and did not take that position. He continued to work in the Democratic Party and helped elect David Hill governor of New York State, who was involved with many things at that time period. In 1886, Parker was nominated for our local Supreme Court, our trial court judge. And he stayed in that position for many years, and that was full-time. Now, many people describe Parker as being dull, colorless, not very exciting, these things that have been written about him, that he wasn't too exciting and so on. But he really was a friendly guy, and he had a lot of friends up in Albany. And they got together in 1886, and they knew that New York State was considering a constitutional amendment of forever wild lands. And they thought they'd have their own little retreat here in Ulster County up in the Catskills. So they got together and bought 1,400 acres up near Slide Mountain. And Parker actually took title to it, and it was several years before he transferred it over to the club that he belonged to. The history of that was, and the forever wild lands, was that after the tanning industry moved out of Ulster County, and the companies just left that terrible land, didn't pay their taxes, and Ulster County took over lots and lots of hilly, rough, rocky lands that nobody could do anything with. And Ulster County owed the state of New York $400,000. So a deal was made. We'll transfer all of this Ulster County property over to New York State, and New York will cancel the Ulster County debt. So they did that, and that was right before the constitutional amendment making state lands forever wild. So the property that Parker and his friends had purchased was right in the middle of that huge amount of state-owned lands. And they formed a club, and this will be interesting as we move into the politics of the next 2 decades. So, as you see here, there is a lodge up there in Big Indian, and that dates back close to 1890 or so, and it still stands today. Judge Parker was the first president of that club, and I was the president in 2006 of that club. So that's one of my reasons that I know something about Parker and have an interest in it. In 1887, Parker moved to, I may have to advance a couple here. One more. Notice that one, 1 Pearl Street in Kingston. That's where he lived. He purchased that in 1887. And when I did some research as to what he may have owned all around Kingston, Ulster County, and so on, deeds in the clerk's office always say it's in the city of Kingston, county of Ulster, it's in the town of Rosendale, county of Ulster, and so on. In fact, the clerk will reject your papers if you don't have that. But I ran across a deed to Parker, and it didn't have that. I said, well, I wonder why that's recorded. Well, he purchased pew number 71 in the Reformed Protestant Dutch Church and recorded a deed to pew number 71. We're going to get back to that a little bit later. Okay. So he's serving as a Supreme Court judge. They didn't have an intermediate court at that time, what we call the appellate division, before you get to the highest court. But they did start a second division of the Court of Appeals, and he was appointed to that and served on that in 1889. Now to digress a little bit to something else that he was involved in, and much of my material that I have came from attorney Jack St. John, who was quite interested in Parker for a couple of reasons. And when he passed away, his family was kind enough to give me all the material that Jack had acquired. And some of you might remember the Ulster Publishing monthly that it came out for quite a while. I'm not sure, it was a great magazine. And Jack St. John wrote an article about a big problem in embezzlement at Ulster Savings Bank in the early 1890s. So word got out that 1 or 2 people in Ulster Savings had run off with a huge amount of money, and the depositors wanted to get their money before it went bankrupt, and they all lined up outside. We want our money, we want our money. Well, Parker was one of the trustees of Ulster Savings Bank, and he and another trustee got on the Dayliner. You could take the Dayliner to New York City and back in one day in those days. And he and this other trustee went down to New York and came back with satchels full of money. I'm not sure how they got it all from some bank down there. And Parker went in and he says, if you want your money, you can have it. We've got the money here. But I think you would be wise if you just left your money here. And the people thought about it, and when Parker said, I pledge my word, they all went home. They didn't withdraw all their money, and Ulster Savings was saved for another day. I will mention the 2 newspapers in Kingston at that time. Newspapers were very, very important. And of course, you had the battles, the political battles. And Parker's paper was called the Kingston Leader, and that had his viewpoint of his party. And then the Kingston Freeman, well, that was owned, like everything else in Kingston, by the Kirkendall family, the son-in-law of Thomas Cornell. They had the barges, they had the trolleys, they had the trains. They eventually bought the canal. Moving on into the politics and how we eventually get our friend to run for President of the United States, we're going to go to the 1896 convention of the Democratic Party. That was in Chicago. There were no clear favorites. They didn't have primaries in those days, so the various factions would make their speeches, they'd have a vote, and they had a vote, and they had a vote. And William Jennings Bryan was only 36 years old. He came to that convention with little support, but time went on as they voted again and again, and he gave more and more speeches. And finally, Bryan was the nominee in 1896. So, and he made his very famous speech at that time, because he was, of course, for the Midwest and for silver, and the Eastern establishment was always for the gold standard, and that was the big battle, gold versus silver. And Bryan got up and said, "Having behind us the producing masses of the nation, we will answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold.'" One of the most famous political speeches of all time. So, following that convention, if you were going to have a chance to be elected President of the United States and get enough electoral votes, the most important place you can go is New York. New York had the most electoral votes, and without winning that, you wouldn't have much of a chance. Bryan knew that. So he journeyed to, following the convention, he journeyed to Red Hook for some rest, and then it was time for him to take a trip to see the chairman of the state Democratic Party, who was, of course, at Winnisook Lake. So he came across the Hudson. He was met by a fellow by the name of Charlie Schultz, who was the first Republican ever allowed at Winnisook as a member, because they wanted to keep this non-political. And Bryan, of course, came up on the train, the Delaware and Hudson, up to Big Indian, and eventually 8 miles up the mountain to Winnisook Lake. And here we have William Jennings Bryan sitting on the porch, actually standing on the porch. He's the one with the white shirt standing there. So he came in 1896 to Winnisook, hoping that he could get the endorsement of the state Democratic Party. Parker was probably there, but being a judge was not prominent in any of the political nominations at that time. And Bryan gave, as he always did, a flowery, great, wonderful speech, and the next day he left without the endorsement of the state Democratic Party. So it was going to be a difficult time for him. And he was running against William McKinley. McKinley, like most candidates of those days, stayed home. They didn't go out and campaign. He sat on his porch in Canton, Ohio, and people came to him. Bryan was different. Bryan went off by himself by train, often buying his own ticket, sleeping on the train, and campaigned throughout the country, giving many, many, many speeches. And of course, he was unsuccessful. Bryan was unsuccessful in that campaign and election. 1897, it was time for Alton Parker to run for Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. And he did run, and he was elected. And what's quite remarkable, he was the only Democrat to win a New York statewide election in the decade of the 1890s. Very impressive that he was able to do that. Here's Parker. You can see how he dressed even on a casual day, and how he dressed as Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. Then his friends from the Winnisook Club honored him down at the Waldorf Astoria, I think in 1897. So all the time, living here in Ulster County. He was a hardworking judge, had many great opinions. I'm going to talk about one kind of famous case that they still talk about today, and that was the case of Abigail Robeson. As you can tell, she was a good-looking gal from Rochester, New York, near Eastman Kodak, and her boyfriend took a picture of her, and then to her surprise, her likeness shows up on a bag of flour. And she was offended by that. She did not give her permission to use her likeness for this commercial purpose. So she sued, invasion of my privacy. This should be stopped. And she was successful at the trial level. But it went to the appellate court because the flour company had money and they could afford to appeal that, and went up to the appellate division. She won again. But they weren't through. Went all the way up to the highest court, the Court of Appeals, where Alton Parker is sitting as the chief judge. And Abigail, if I could just describe a little something about her, she was an attractive, strong-minded, sensitive, intelligent, tenacious, intrepid, plucky, but shy young woman. So when her case got there before the 7-member Court of Appeals, she had 3 votes to uphold her verdict, and she had 3 against. And it came down to the 7th member, that would be the chief judge, that would be Alton Parker. And he said, "You don't have that right in New York. That does not exist in the law, a right of privacy." So she was denied. However, Judge Parker said, the legislature ought to get to work and create this right of privacy. And Article 52 of the New York Civil Rights Law was enacted shortly thereafter, still exists today, which gives her the right for damages and the right for an injunction so that a private person's likeness cannot be used by anybody who cares to do so. So that's one of his famous cases. In 1898, he was able to move from that house you saw in Kingston down to Esopus on the Hudson River, near Esopus Island, looking at Esopus Island, to a place called Rosemont. And that is an older photo of Rosemont in Esopus, New York. And that was his mansion. He kept acquiring other farms nearby. It became quite an active fruit farm, a dairy farm, and so on. It's a beautiful spot, looking at the Hudson River and the Esopus Island. At that time, in doing my research, as I mentioned, various deeds that are of record, I find that he sold pew number 71 in the church. He had paid $545 for that pew, and he sold it for $400. So he took a small loss. But when you think of workers, maybe they made $15 a month back in the 1890s. He's paid $545 for a pew. Of course, it was to the church, but still. But he sold it because it was time to go to another church. And that's because his daughter had married Reverend Charles Hall, who was the reverend at the Episcopal Church. So he thought he should be in the same church as his daughter and son-in-law. So that was the reason for the switch. There's another photo from the river looking up to his home. And at one time there was a great boathouse down there. I'm not sure the year of this. That boathouse no longer exists, but the town road does go all the way down to that point if you want to just drive down there and see the spot. And the house is up on the hill. It's been refurbished lately and is in wonderful shape. It's in private hands. Next door is what is often called Parker's library. So he had this home also, much older. And this is a shot of it from the riverside looking west, looking up the hill at the home. And another shot of that looking at the house with the Hudson River behind it. So that's been refurbished and put back in shape, and a friend of ours currently owns that house. So Parker continues on in his role as Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals, and the next convention for President of the United States is in 1900. And McKinley, doing well, is going to run again. He did drop his running mate and took a fellow from New York. I guess they wanted to get rid of Teddy Roosevelt as governor, so they feel, listen, vice president's a place where people are put that you don't really want to hear too much from them. Let's make Roosevelt the vice president. So sure enough, Teddy Roosevelt ran with McKinley. And they presided, and again, William Jennings Bryan was the candidate for the Democratic Party, losing again. And a bit of trivia, can anybody think of who the vice presidential running mate of Bryan was? Very good, very good. Adlai Stevenson. You know, most of us remember his son Adlai Stevenson running against Eisenhower, but that's a name from the past. So that family's been around a long time. So Parker was not involved in 1900. He was a judge. Some people were after Parker to run for governor of New York in 1902, but he decided not to do that. He kept on the Court of Appeals. He really liked that work. But now we begin to move into the convention of 1904, leading eventually to the race of Judge Parker against Teddy Roosevelt. Who was the competition for Parker? William Randolph Hearst, who owned the newspaper. He was thought to be a possible Democratic nominee. They were kind of finished with Bryan. He'd run twice, lost twice. They weren't going anywhere. It was time to move away from the Midwest. The Democrats wanted to get back to the money interest in the East and see if they could possibly win the presidency, take over the White House. So the various delegates went to St. Louis that year. Parker would not have gone. This is not something that the candidates did, attend the conventions. They would stay home and their supporters would go there. Among those from Ulster County that went out to St. Louis to support him was my grandmother's brother, Alton Harcourt. He was an attorney in Kingston at that time and a supporter and friend of Parker. So after all the speeches, they finally got around to a vote at the convention at 5:45 a.m. These were tough conventions. They went on and on. And I think you needed 2/3 of the vote, and he had 600 and some. It was just shy. And when he was so close, Parker was so close to getting it, he only needed 9 more votes. When they saw that, certain delegates immediately changed their vote, and Parker had the victory on the first ballot of the Democratic Convention in 1904. Still working, it's just early July, and he had more work to do. He had almost another month of work at the Court of Appeals before he could actually accept the nomination. The platform of the Democratic Party didn't say anything about gold and silver, and everybody wanted to know, what's the story? And the newspapers were demanding, what's the story of the party? What's the story with you, Parker? Are you for the gold standard or not? So when they pressed him, he did what he usually did in July. He would get up, and the first thing he'd do is he'd go down to the Hudson River and take a swim. He did that every morning. And then he would get on horseback, and he'd ride around the back roads of Esopus. But then he went down and he sent a telegram to the convention. And he told them there that, I regard the gold standard as firmly and irrevocably established and shall act accordingly, if the action of the convention shall be ratified. As the platform is silent on the subject, my view should be known to the convention, and is proved to be unsatisfactory, I request you to decline the nomination for me at once so that another may be nominated. So he took a firm stand right away, and people liked that, and they wanted to go ahead with Parker as their nominee. So he received that. He became somewhat of a hero because of that strong opinion. But there were more work to do, so it was still into August before the Court of Appeals released 26 more opinions. At that point, he resigned from the court and accepted with a speech to be the nominee of the Democratic Party against Teddy Roosevelt, who had been president for about 3 years following the assassination of McKinley. And of course, Roosevelt was very well known, and he had the bully pulpit, he had the White House. It was easy for him to campaign. So by doing that, Parker, by resigning from being a judge, he became a real statesman again, and that's why I refer to him as the last of the Gilded Age statesmen. For campaigning, he selected Henry Davis from West Virginia as his running mate. Well, Henry Davis was 81 years old and not the most spry guy to be running around the country campaigning, so they didn't do much at all. Teddy Roosevelt selected Charles Fairbanks, who did tour a great deal in campaigning. But that year, there weren't really that many issues. Really, probably one of the dullest campaigns. You had 2 New Yorkers. You had Parker and Teddy Roosevelt from the same state running against each other without major issues. Parker sat on his porch overlooking the Hudson, and if people wanted to come and talk to him, the press and so on, they were welcome, but he wasn't going out of his way to go anyplace. Some of the things that were made available to the public at that time, Puck magazine was one of the real favorites at that time. So that was a cover from that time period of our two candidates. And Judge Parker. And a campaign button. I had one at home and I forgot to put it on today. That was not good. So as the election approached, it was uncovered that Roosevelt's campaign, because you remember they were always trying to break up trusts, and the trusts had a great deal of money and so on, that Roosevelt's campaign was actually shaking down some of these trusts to get a lot of money for their campaign. And finally, they got Parker to bring up that issue, and he made a couple of speeches down in New York and New Jersey and so on, but it was right before the election. So after he made these accusations, Roosevelt says, prove them. Well, he didn't have any time left. It was a day or two, and you didn't have TV to get on there. So that kind of just died off. Election day came. Parker, being, I guess, somewhat of a dull guy, as some people thought, what do you do when you are running for president of the United States while you're waiting for the election returns? Well, Parker went to the dentist that day. He didn't fare too well. Teddy Roosevelt got 56% of the popular vote, and Parker only 38%. A variety of socialist and prohibition parties made up the balance of that. So he was defeated. They were even selling trading cards back then. I didn't realize that, but when I saw this on eBay, I had to have it. Long before they were doing baseball cards, I guess. I'm surprised. So Parker then went from being rather obscure back to being even more obscure. He decided to practice law in New York City, and he was very successful. He did labor law and other things, but he'd been on the Court of Appeals for 7 years as chief judge, so he was well known. But he remained extremely active. He was a delegate to the Democratic conventions of 1908 and 1912. Of course, his big goal would be placed on the United States Supreme Court. That would be the ultimate for him. But we didn't have a Democrat in the White House until Woodrow Wilson, and Wilson, being a big progressive, didn't have any reason for a conservative like Parker, so that did not happen. But Parker was president of the American Bar Association during that time period. He was president of the New York Bar Association, and a very successful law practice, commuting back and forth to his Esopus home from New York City. His wife, Mary, who had been married to since 1873, died in 1917, and Parker remarried. He transferred his large mansion, Rosemont, to his only child, his daughter Bertha Hall. He did have a son who died at age 7 through an accident, and Parker never talked about his son. I'm sure he was, devastated by it. And then Parker gave the library building to his second wife, and she remained there a long time, Amelia, until I think in the 50s. His law firm was known as Parker, Marshall, and Auchincloss in New York City. When home, he liked to get on his horseback and ride around the back roads of Esopus. That was good exercise for someone, and that's a picture of him there. And just to make a connection to someone here in the audience, my wife's father moved to Esopus in around 1921 and remembers, as a young boy, seeing Parker and his wife riding on horseback through the back roads of Esopus. And then in 26, he finally got around to signing his will. Maybe he had a will before that, but he did sign one in March, and then he passed away in May of 1926. And when I went to the Wiltwyck Cemetery in Kingston and asked, where could I go? Can I find the Parker monument? And they said, was he a senator? They didn't know who he was or where it was, but I went around until I found it. So that's his tomb there. And on one end of it is his wife, Mary Louise Parker, and his very young son, John. And then on the back of it, it recites numerous things that Parker accomplished. Supreme Court, Second Division, Court of Appeals, presidential nominee, president of the American Bar Association, president of New York Counties, and so on. So he had quite a career. So he's somebody that isn't well known nationally by any means, but hopefully here in Ulster County we'll know that we had somebody run for president of the United States who served the legal community for many, many years. And with that tombstone, I think I've gotten to the end of my presentation.
John Wadlin.
For anybody who missed the long series of Kingston's Buried Treasures, the lectures are on the City of Kingston website. So you can go on there and learn about a lot of famous people like George Clinton and General Sharp and Corkendall and all the others. So glad you could come and fill all the seats. They seem to know just the right number to put out. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Today, we regard Teddy Roosevelt as this wildly popular fellow, and anybody who was any Democrat who ran against him in 1904 was crazy. Was that the perception at the time?
He certainly was quite popular, yes. The Democrats were trying to get some of the political power back, and they needed somebody in the East who could do that. A big difference between the two candidates is that Parker was truly a peace candidate, and Teddy Roosevelt probably liked war more than any president we ever had. He thought war was just grand. So that would have been one of the issues of many people at that time. But whether Parker regretted going off the court at that time, but I guess if your country and your party says you're the best chance we have, you go with it. Yep. Hi.
Were the Republican and Democratic parties similar then to what they are now regarding their values, standards?
No, I think they're probably quite different, evolving there. Actually, that was a time where progressives, Teddy Roosevelt, first came along, while the more conservative was the Democrats.
Was that still a residue of the Civil War? Or?
Well, Bryan and Parker, they always won the South. There was only one party in the South in those days, the Democratic Party. I mean, they didn't want the blacks to vote because the blacks were Republicans, so they weren't allowed to vote. So the Democrats won the South all the time. Bryan carried it, Parker carried it. That's where his votes came from. He had 140 electoral votes, but not in the East. Yes, sir.
Related question: Why was Parker not a Republican?
Well, he started out in the Democratic Party, working in the 1870s for his friend Judge Schoolmaker, and that's where he found a home with friends that he formed the club with. They were 8 Democrats, and again, the values and so on at that time, he felt more comfortable in that party, even though being in Ulster County, it probably would have been easier for him. But there was a lot of Democratic power in New York State back then. He worked for Governor Hill, a Democrat, and David Hill was very instrumental and powerful in the constitutional amendments and so on that New York passed in the 1880s and 1890s. And Grover Cleveland, who was from Buffalo, New York, so that was a New Yorker that he supported. Yes?
Thank you very much for tonight. We live out in Accord where the sign is.
Okay.
And I'm very impressed by him. We did a little free library that we put right there. I thought it was very fitting for his legacy.
Wonderful. Yeah.
I appreciate tonight. Thank you very much for all your research.
Oh, well, thank you. You're welcome. And I'm sure with the time that he came, he would have had quite an involvement with the D&H Canal. He was right there in Accord, so he would be getting supplies and probably travel to High Falls and Kingston and so on the canal at times. Yep. So great place to talk about him.